There they battled up Iwo Jima Hill, 250 men, but only 27 lived to walk back down again. And when the fight was over and Old Glory raised, among the men who held it high was the Indian Ira Hayes.
1, 2, 3. We are live on Take Your Best Shots podcast with Kip Hedges, who is a individual who's been involved in the workers' movement for many years. Welcome, Kip.
Good morning.
Hey, I just wanted to ask you, since we're going to just jump into this right now and try to get specific on the spot, explain what the workers' force is in today's world.
I would say workers' movement. What I mean by that is sometimes, usually the union movement and the workers' movement are the same. The labor movement, the workers' movement, the union movement are all sort of equal in meaning. But to me, the workers' movement is something deeper because sometimes, especially in the last 30 or 40 years, unions have become somewhat bureaucratized compared to the 30s and the 40s, where they were more willing to take action. They were more democratic. I think you're starting to see a return to that in a lot of ways, but that's what I mean by the workers' movement, is the broad fight of workers in the United States and around the world for a real voice and for potentially a different kind of economy, not the trickle-down theory that we have right now.
So what is the workers' movement fighting for in today's world?
Well, I think there's been quite a bit in the news about inequality, about a massive gap between workers, broadly speaking, and the 1%, the whole 99%, 1% thing. So I would say that the workers' movement is fighting for things like a $15 an hour minimum wage, for more ease of unionization. It's very difficult nowadays because of all the laws and red tape. I think we're talking about fighting for some of the social programs that you saw in the 30s, where the workers' movement was fighting for Social Security, for unemployment insurance, and end to child labor. Today, those things would be free college, Medicare for all, $15 an hour minimum wage, things like that.
Okay, so it's really aligned with what Bernie Sanders was talking about in his 2016 run for the president.
Yeah, in a lot of ways it is.
Yeah, because he was talking much about like the free education and the the $15 an hour minimum wage. And one thing, what about Medicare and free medicine for everybody, or health care? Is that included in what you're fighting for?
Yeah, I would say that what Canada has right now is probably a pretty good example of, in my mind, what we should be shooting for.
Okay. Now, what I'm thinking and what I'm hearing is it's closely aligned with the socialist movement in the United States that we're seeing right now.
Well, I think the socialist movement and the workers' movement have been very, very closely aligned and have crisscrossed over the years. So I would say that is true.
Okay.
By socialist movement, I don't think, I'm certainly not talking about North Korea or China or Russia or anything like that. Everybody gets to have their own toothbrush. If you want to start a small business up, you can. But I think right now you've seen just enormous amounts of economic and political power concentrated in the hands of very, very, very few people.
Right. Now, how do you get to that point? How do you organize and make that movement have a voice?
It's kind of the,
It's the how-to, because there's people that may align with you,
mhm.
but they don't know about you or the movement. And how do you get all? Because the United States is a big country. How
Well,
do you get that power
mhm.
to get more power for the people?
Um, I think the Bernie Sanders campaign was a pretty good example of, I know I felt this way, that all of a sudden I realized, and millions of other people realized, that wow, there's way more people that think like me than I thought there were. I think it's things like the West Virginia teacher strike, where they decided they had enough in West Virginia, and they said legality be damned, and they organized a very effective rank and file strike that was illegal, and that kind of brought to light the fact that workers still have quite a bit of power, and started to kind of revitalize some of the dormant tendencies of the labor movement. So things like that. When workers say we've had enough, I think the Delta organizing drive is another example where probably the biggest thing driving that is workers all over the Delta system are saying, we are not going to be work short staff anymore. We are not going to feel like we're one step away from getting fired over even pretty minor infractions. And so that's an indication to me that things are changing in a major way, that a lot of the propaganda that Delta used to use to try and keep the union out isn't really working right now.
So, would you think that the millennials have more of a socialist outlook than, let's say, somebody of my age? Because it seems like the millennials are falling in line with a lot of those views.
There's a sea change on the part of young people.
Mm-hmm.
I was just reading an article about, I think it was in the New York Times, about the changing attitudes of young evangelicals, who have kind of been the bulwark of the Trump movement. And this was explaining that the younger evangelicals are comparing the teachings of Jesus Christ to kind of a socialistic way of looking at things, like the dividing of the bread, the loaves and fish, and so I think that's even amongst very spiritual or religious millennials, there's a big change.
And that group typically is a red voter without a thought.
Right.
You know, they are Republican all the way down. So you're saying that's changing? Because I haven't heard that. That's actually quite interesting, how they're taking the biblical side and trying to convert it into a socialist outlook.
Well, I can see it in even I go to church pretty much every Sunday,
Okay.
and I can see it amongst a lot of the young people in my church, where things that make my generation a little uncomfortable, like LBGTQ.
You got it. Good job, man.
And transgender issues.
Mhm.
They have a much different attitude than the 40, 50, and 60-year-olds do.
Well, I would agree with that. I tend to have more of the younger views towards that, because I don't really care who you love or who you are with or anything, as long as you don't interfere with my life. And I won't interfere with yours, with my views. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I
So-
think it's.
Oh, go ahead.
One of the great sort of achievements of the civil rights movement that people don't even think about is the right to love who you want.
Right.
And in 1950, you did not have that right. Legally, in most states, you could not have an interracial marriage. So the right to love is who you want is incredibly important. I think young people today embrace that in a major way.
Yeah, and it's not just the interracial. It could be, homosexual. It could be anything
Right.
of who you love.
Yep.
Let's talk about the millennials for a second, because that really interests me. Of why is this sea change? Do you think that it's because they're maturing and they're seeing that the cards are stacked against them in a lot of ways, or do you think it's a change of how they view life, or both?
I think usually people's consciousness gets shaped a lot by what their conditions are. And in 2018, the opportunities that you or me might have had, in a lot of ways seem closed off to them. And I think that's accurate, that, the whole college debt thing, that you can come out of getting your education and immediately be saddled with an enormous amount of debt. I mean, I remember when I graduated from high school, and this is a fact, I was living in Massachusetts at the time. I grew up in New York, and then I moved to Massachusetts to get the hell out. But
You don't have either one of those accents, though.
I still have some words.
You can pull it
that
off? You can pull it off?
Yeah.
Okay.
That my kids make fun of me for
good.
pronouncing the wrong way.
Good.
But I could go and get a job making a decent living at 18 in one factory, and then, in fact, did this 6 months later, quit after I had used up all my vacation time, and went across the street to another factory and got hired immediately at a decent wage. And today, that is simply unthinkable. It just does not exist.
So I have a theory, and I think it is an accurate theory. And it's when kids get out of out of high school, they're expected to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
And when they go to college, many of them get degrees that are not useful. But they're pressed to go to college for societal reasons, but they're also pressed because it makes some people some money. And if people were to really sit down with their kids, or the kids were really thinking, there's other avenues. There's the trades. We are going to have a shortage of electricians, plumbers.
Mm-hmm.
In the trades, you can make a decent living. You have apprenticeships that you can learn the trade, and then you go into the trade that you've been trained in,
Mm-hmm.
and there's jobs there. There are plenty of jobs. Just across the street here, you see hundreds of men and women that are using those trades, and they have an ability to have a family, live comfortably, and they're not saddled with $100,000 of student loans. So why are less people going into the trades, do you think?
I think there's, you hit on part of it, which is that banks make an enormous amount of money off of student loans.
They do.
And I think the other thing is that just sort of coming out of the last part of the 20th century, there was an enormous amount of stock put into the idea that college education was it, that's how you made it. And as you're saying, that's not necessarily true.
Right. I think that if you look at it from a distance, and you see, okay, if I want to be a doctor, I want to be an engineer, I want to be something that needs an extreme amount of education. Even being an attorney,
Mm-hmm.
you have to go through and you have to pass the bar.
Yes.
Those professions, you need that college education.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to be some kind of professor at a university, you need the education.
Mm-hmm.
And so go and be a car salesman or you want to be something of that, and you have a lot of college educated people that necessarily didn't need that college education.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's options out there. Military is a great option. You can go learn a skill and then come out of the military,
Mm-hmm.
and you could be employable. And so I question the need for a college education today. There just seems to be so many other options.
So let me flip it around for a second.
Yeah, please do.
Today, even if you get a lot of education and you become an adjunct professor, for example, you might be making less than $15 an hour. You can be a lawyer, and because so many people went into the law field, you might be making way less than what you thought you were going to be
Absolutely.
making. And so you are doing some kind of legal call center and being a server on the weekends to try and pay off your loans. If you're a teacher, even in some of the northern prosperous states, you might not be making all that much money. And if you're in Oklahoma, Kentucky, West Virginia, Arizona, you are making very, very little money, hence the teacher strikes. So I think in a lot of ways, and even in the building trades, what you see now is that the construction companies in a lot of states have simply figured out how to move unions out of the way, and have even built up their own contracting organizations to provide the same apprenticeship programs, et cetera, that unions do in many states. And I think you're gonna like the prevailing wage is under attack in a lot of states, which is kind of the staple of building trades and construction work. I don't even think that's really safe. I think that you see downwardly mobile, even for some of the jobs where you've been able to make a decent living in the past. There's simply nothing that isn't under attack because of the enormous amount of political and economic power that a very few people have. They figured out how to, even in nursing, which is kind of a gold-plated, you go to nursing school, you're going to be getting a job and making a decent living, but staffing becomes a huge issue where you can't take care of your patients because of cutbacks on staffing in hospitals. So no matter where you look, the 99% is under attack.
So let's talk about that, because the teachers, the nurses, and the construction are typically heavy unionized.
Mm-hmm.
What changed? Now, did the union lose power? Did they snuggle up with the construction and the hospital management? What changed where they gave away? Or were the laws changed? What was the change where the union, the people in the union now are downwardly mobile? What's the change? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Is it the laws? Because you have a lot of right-to-work states now. But what's the change? Because usually, in my head, the union's there to protect that.
Mm-hmm. And I think unions are adjusting to the new reality, but I think it's taken a long time. And I think it's taken some pretty deep attacks for the unions to adjust to the new terrain that they're on, and some still haven't at all, and they're going to be swept away as time goes by because they haven't adjusted to new circumstances where, like you say, the laws on every different level, whether it's prevailing wage or right to work or whatever it is, that make it far more difficult to unionize. The, uh, the people with lots of money and lots of power are figuring out ways to undercut what working people have, even at the higher levels, higher as in higher income and higher union density. They've figured out ways to undercut that.
What ways have they used?
Well, certainly right to work is one way. I'll just give you one example.
Yeah, give it to me, man. I want to hear it.
So at Delta, up until 2000, oh God, I can't remember the date, but like 2011 or 12, right after we lost the Delta union election.
And that's for the ramp workers?
Yeah, for the ramp workers and the flight attendants.
Okay.
It used to be that you could collect 35% of the work group signing union cards, and you could then ask for an election. Delta got Lindsey Graham, who's a Republican from South Carolina, and some of the other politicians that they're very tight with. And when the FAA reauthorization bill came up, they got Lindsey Graham and some of these other guys to say, we will not vote for the FAA reauthorization bill unless you increase that 35% to 50%, making it harder to actually call for a union election. So that's one tiny little way in the airline industry that they've made it more difficult, but it's instructive as to the degree to which they pay attention to passing laws which strengthen them and weaken us.
Well, the union also has lobbyists, and you would think that they would be able to at least counter that at some level.
Can't match the money.
It's a money issue?
I think so.
Okay.
I mean, you can counter it in some states with the number of union members that you can get out to do. I mean, kind of like Bernie Sanders did. Lots of door knockers, lots of $27 contributions, that kind of stuff, which properly organized can be a counter to the 1%, but the 1% has really figured out how to control not just the Republicans but the Democrats as well. Sorry to say it.
Yeah. One of the things that with unions that I, as a libertarian, just drives me crazy is that they give a lot of money to Democrats,
Mm-hmm.
and Democrats that I don't think even work on their behalf,
Well,
and it's like you're just giving money to an empty hole. They just keep giving it to them because they're Democrats.
well, and as a socialist, I would agree with you.
We agree on something, Kip. That's
Yes.
good. Because it looks like, I went back in preparation for a different podcast and looked at the money that the unions are giving the politicians.
Mm-hmm.
And that's normal. Companies give it. I'm not questioning that they give the money as a donation, because that's been the United States way for years.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at to see if they gave, like Senator Feinstein, let's say, 100,000,
Mm-hmm.
which way she voted on certain bills.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't always vote for the union.
You.
And I'm wondering, well, what is it? Why doesn't the union or the unions get together and say, we need to support people that are going to support our cause?
You're speaking my religion right
Okay.
now.
So why do they continue to support people that don't support their issue? That boggles me, because it's almost like you continue to pay for something but don't get anything in return.
I do not disagree with you at all. I think there's a lot of people in the union movement and the workers movement who would agree with you, and that's part of the reason why you saw a lot of union people were very attracted to Bernie Sanders.
Correct.
And not just people making $10 an hour, but lots of construction workers, manufacturing workers, truck drivers. You could go to coal miners in West Virginia, and an old Jewish guy from New York who supported gay rights was very popular. So I think the unions really have to start doing exactly what you're talking about. And that might, to me, it means at some point, and hopefully sooner than later, you have to have a political party which actually represents the interests of working class people. Because I follow politics pretty closely, and I will probably vote for a bunch of Democrats in this election, simply because the alternative is horrifying to me. But we always get stuck behind the 8 ball by not very early on putting money and energy into political candidates who actually support our side.
Right. I think that you have a political candidate sitting in your own nest that should explore some kind of political career in the future, and it's Dan McCurdy. I believe that he has the passion, and he has the honesty and the integrity to actually do something at some level. I don't know if it's a state level, a federal level, but those are the type of people that the Democrats need to encourage to join the party.
I agree with you
Because
100%.
I'm not a Democrat, but if I was looking at it, I had a guy on, his name is Tom Hall, and he's a progressive young man that probably will
Yeah,
one day,
I know Tommy Hall.
yeah, he will one day probably go into politics.
Mhm.
Even though my politics are different than his, I
Mhm.
would vote for him
Mhm.
because I trust him.
No,
You know what I'm saying?
I know exactly what
And
you're
so the trust level, he would do the right thing on any bill. And even if I disagree with it, he would vote the right way for his conscience. And I think Dan McCurdy's got the same thing. And what I'm trying to get to right now is that there are people that the Democrats have, and the Republicans, but the unions typically support the Democrats.
Mhm.
The Democrats have moved so far away from the working class person that it seems like you almost need a revolution or a change of guard within that party to really represent the people, because a lot of workers continue to vote for them, but just like the unions who don't get anything out, the workers aren't getting anything out either. And it boggles me still that we have the Democrats, I'll even go back to Hillary Clinton. She seemed to forget about the working class person and focused more on the progressive because she was going against Bernie.
Well,
And she tried to get his voters. But in the meantime, she forgot about who really will vote for her come election time.
Well, and I will tell you this story, because of, there's a Delta Reservation Center on the Iron Range.
Yeah, in Chisholm.
Yeah, so I still know people on the Iron Range who are unionists. They voted for Obama twice, and they voted for Bernie Sanders, and then they voted for Donald Trump because they wanted to give Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party establishment the biggest finger possible. Like, I'm sick of what you're doing. You do not represent me anymore. You say you do, but you absolutely don't. So I would, again, not disagree with you at all. I think there's some real challenges that people like Tom Hall and Dan McCurdy, or whoever it is,
Mhm.
the men and women from nowhere would face, because the dark side of the force is very strong in politics. So you would have to have a strong party presence to help counter the dark side of the force, and it is absolutely there. It's there to a certain extent in the union movement as well. People who are careerists, they're not really interested in workers. They're interested in their own career. Certainly not everybody, but that does exist. So figuring out how to build a movement that can push forward leaders that are absolutely trustworthy, their integrity is their trademark, and their alliance with their own people, working class people, is unquestioned. That's what we got to have, but there's a lot of challenges to actually make that happen.
I think the first place the party or the group or the organization has to start is getting candidates that actually believe in what they say.
That would be a good start.
Well, I mean, I'm not talking this is not a Democrat issue, it's also a Republican issue.
Mm-hmm.
They're saying what will get them voted in. And there's a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you have this and this. You're saying this, but you believe this.
Mm-hmm.
But when you put them together, no matter what your ideology is, you're going to have a lot of power. And look what Bernie did.
Yeah.
If you got somebody who was younger, more charismatic, that has actually been in the trenches,
Mm-hmm.
that is able to speak very well, that has a passion. I'm going back to even like John F. Kennedy. Remember when nobody gave him a shot when he started running for president?
Mm-hmm.
But he had something.
Yeah.
That's the person I'm talking about. And then once that person comes to the forefront, then you line up behind them. The other people will say, okay, I can do this. And I think you win elections on numbers. And then how do you do that? With money.
Well,
So-
the money has to come from the people, though, because
I agree. Yeah.
if you're taking a bunch of money from corporations, corporate lobbyists, etc., if they're the ones who are helping you to finance that mailer or that robocall or renting out a big arena or something like that, they will expect something in return, and they will come calling. Politicians cannot serve two masters.
Exactly.
And right now, they actually don't even, 99.9% of them serve one master, which is the people who give them a ton of money, which is why the Bernie Sanders example of $27 on average in donations, small donations, that way you're serving one master, which is the working class people that gave you the money.
Yeah, the Democratic National Committee actually screwed Bernie over. So
Oh.
even with the money, he still couldn't do it because his odds were against him. But the other part of it too is that you said you can't serve two masters. We need more people that have one master, just as you were saying, but it has to be the people.
Yes.
And my beliefs aren't necessarily what the Democratic Party
Mhm.
has, but either is Republicans. I had to vote for Donald Trump because I could not vote for Hillary Clinton.
Mhm.
I couldn't. I couldn't. And in retrospect, Hillary might have been better than Donald. She might not have been, but I'm hoping that somebody within the Democratic Party can counter Donald Trump.
I think that
Someone.
the problem is I have zero faith that the Democratic Party is reformable. I don't think that's possible. I think you saw that with Bernie Sanders, where not only weren't they willing to change in terms of program and outlook, even after the election, they went out of their way to make sure that that Bernie was pushed out. And same way
True.
with Keith Ellison, where he was kind of the next one to be the head of the Democratic National Committee, and they completely pushed him out. And no matter what you think about Keith Ellison, it would have been a real signal to all those millions of young people who are looking for a political party or a movement, and so you kind of sidelined that.
Well, right now, if you look at the polls, if you believe the polls, Joe Biden is the number one candidate for the Democrats. He's what, 74 right now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I truly believe if they want to energize the millennials, they're going to have to get somebody else. Joe served his time. He's 8 years of VP, longtime senator, but
Yep.
he is not the guy that's going to energize people to come out to the polls and make a change.
Yep. No question.
But why? Why would he be, it's a little early, but why would he be like the standard bearer?
Name recognition, and here's another thing that really throws polls off, and it's why Bernie was a surprise, is because when they do polls, they call up people who are likely voters, which means that they have voted in the last one or two elections, they're registered, and with Bernie, you saw millions of people come out of the woodwork that never voted before because they were convinced up until that point that the political process had nothing to do with them, that it was a dead end for any kind of change. So I think for with Biden, it's the name recognition. He's a long-time public face, but I agree with you that politics, I think, is going to get much rougher. You can see that already, and I think it's going to get increasingly rough. Part of what has to happen is that the majority of Americans can be mobilized around Bernie's program, particularly if it's somebody who's younger, charismatic, has been through some fights. So I think that it's the person and it's the program.
Okay. Well, I'm in a full agreement with you, and I'm at a point where we have to make changes. The status quo doesn't work. I don't know what the changes will be. I know in my head what I'd like to be, but I'm at such a small minority that my viewpoints aren't going to work. But we do need to make some changes here, and I think that people need to know that their voice counts, no matter what their belief is.
Mm-hmm.
Vote. Get out to vote, and you can make changes.
I mean, clearly that's true. If that wasn't true, then we should just watch football all day and never do anything. But changes have happened. I mean, there have been huge movements to destroy Jim Crow in the South and segregation. At least legal segregation. There have been huge movements to have real unions that won real gains for working class people. But I think humanity's at an impasse right now in a lot of ways. The economy really does not work for the vast majority. The planet is in grave danger, and we are going to have to make some major changes in the way we do things if we want to even survive as a species.
Yeah, you just brought up a whole different thing with the planet, but we can't get into that. I would
Okay.
love to talk about
Okay.
that sometime because I have lots of thoughts on that, and it's
Okay.
probably closely aligned to where you're at. Believe me. Now, the one thing that we need to also look at is that the politicians only serve the one master, as you said.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the obvious choice? Get rid of those politicians. And with the money that they have and the ability of them to keep on being reelected, we need to change that somehow. And I look at this one election down with Ted Cruz and Beto O'Rourke.
Mm-hmm.
I've listened to both of them. Ted Cruz is just not a likable guy.
No.
He's not likable, and I would tend to vote more Republican,
Mm-hmm.
but he's not likable, and he's so far to the right that I can't believe that he's leading with Beto O'Rourke in that election. And we'll see who wins that one. It's not over yet. By the time this comes out, we will know. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've paid any attention to that election.
I was just watching a thing on 60 Minutes last night about O'Rourke and Cruz.
And what did that say? Because I didn't see that show.
Said tight race, that they are very different in approach, that neither one of them are in the center, and that politics in Texas is about to take a big change. Even if O'Rourke loses, they said that the increase in population of people of color, in the participation of young people in the political process with vastly different views than the traditional Texas Republican views. Like the rest of the country, there's a sea change coming on many, many different issues. To me, we know that's coming, so the big question is, how do you organize that to be most effective to make the kind of changes that can actually offer a future to human beings? Because to me, clearly, what happened in the Soviet Union was not an answer for humanity. You know, the old way of looking at things of a one-party state with a planned economy means utopia for humanity. It's not true. Clearly, trickle-down economics with all power resting in a handful of usually older white men's pockets, clearly that doesn't work either. So what is it that would work? I mean, that's why I'm a socialist and not a Stalinist or a Maoist. And I don't have all the answers, but I know that humanity is capable of doing something way different and way better than we've done in the past.
That is a wonderful closing statement, man. That was beautiful. I appreciate you coming in and giving me your time, and it's been great talking to you, Kip.
Yeah, likewise.
All
It's
right.
been very good.
You did a
Thanks.
great job.
Yeah.
Thank you.